Does a Verstappen versus Albon paradox exist? One in which only one Red Bull driver can do well at a time. It has been suggested that when Verstappen finds podium, Albon struggles. And when Albon has a strong performance, something must have happened to Max as a result. During several broadcasts this year, the question has been asked, why can only one Red Bull driver do well at a time? But is that actually true? Let's have a closer look. So is there really a Verstappen versus Albon paradox, where when one driver does well, the other driver can't, and vice versa? Well, what I've done here is I've taken a look at all of the races and Grand Prix that Verstappen and Albon have competed against each other while Albon has been promoted to Red Bull so far. Dating back to 2019, we see right off the bat, they have a couple of weekends where Albon actually outperforms Verstappen. But what I really want to look at in this video are two key numbers. Overall average finish of both drivers during their time competing with one another. And more importantly, in red, are the weekends that Max Verstappen finishes on the podium, and taking a look at what Alex Albon did in direct comparison to the success Verstappen's having on those Grand Prix. So let's take a look at Verstappen first. His average finish during all the races and Grand Prix that have happened while these two drivers have been paired together is a 7.2. But in other videos, like I've said, there is other things that need to be taken into account when you look at an average like that. Asterisks are retirements that Verstappen had that were out of his hands. These are mechanical failures that he could do absolutely nothing about. So when you take that into account and readjust his average finish, he's had an average finish of 5.8. There's even one more step you could go. The Tuscan Grand Prix technically was a retirement due to collision, getting caught up in that first lap mayhem. However, he was there because he was having a power failure. It's likely he would have retired due to a mechanical issue anyway. They were having issues on the grid prior to that race. I didn't take that into account because on paper it says collision, but honestly his average finish is maybe a little bit better. However, by comparison, he's had 5 retirements, and during the same time, I was surprised to see this. Alex Albon has not actually had a retirement in a Red Bull yet, which is a pretty awesome stat considering how many races they've had. The other thing to quickly take a look at, Verstappen, 11 podiums. Alex Albon, 1 podium. When you just look at that, it looks very lopsided, and it is to a certain extent, but let's look at the averages. So we have the 5.8 average adjusted over there. Alex Albon's average finish overall in all the Grand Prix that they've been partnered together is 7th. But let's take a look at all the weekends that Max Verstappen podiumed and see if there really is this paradox where for him to do well, Albon does poorly, and when Albon finishes 3rd with a podium there, Verstappen does poorly. Now, if you look at it at a top level, it might look like that, and it's easy to comment on that, which the commenters during these Grand Prix weekends have brought this up now like 2 or 3 times this year alone, which is why I had to make this video. Let's look at those weekends that he podiums. No, there's no paradox. It's a ridiculous commentary and a ridiculous argument to make. Every single weekend that Max Verstappen has podiumed, when you calculate all of the averages of Alex Albon, his average finish is 7th. His overall average finish at Red Bull is 7th. So what are people talking about? It has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not Max Verstappen finishes on the podium. It's a ridiculous argument. Regardless of what Max is doing, Alex Albon's average finish is 7th. Max finishes on the podium, 7th. Max doesn't finish on the podium, retirements, whatever, 7th. And these aren't even rounded numbers like they are over here. That's a clean 7th place average for Alex Albon, regardless of what Max Verstappen does in the number 1 seat at Red Bull. So why is this narrative happening? Well, it's because if you just isolate 1 or 2 Grand Prix, like the Tuscan Grand Prix where Albon gets his first podium, it's easy to look at it and say, oh, Verstappen crashed out. He had issues. Or some of the early ones, Albon finishes 5th, retirement for Verstappen. But it's totally ridiculous to look at it that way. When you look at the overall averages of what's going on, Albon's average has kind of gone down a little bit this year because we found out in 2020 that he hasn't had the same equipment and parts on his car that Verstappen had. Red Bull's trying different things here with that number 2 seat. And meanwhile, the commentators and people like me on YouTube have been unfairly harsh on Alex Albon. We didn't know that information earlier in the season. I made several videos of what was going on with Albon. And we find out a couple weeks into it that, hey, he's not running the same equipment as Verstappen. And again, Albon has had some good weeks in here, a 4th, a 5th, a 3rd. And when you look at some of the comparisons to what Verstappen did in those weeks, it's easy to say, like, hey, what's going on? How come both these cars can't do well at the same time. Well, I'm going to throw out a couple, maybe obvious things, but apparently not, because this keeps coming up during broadcasts. Number one, Verstappen's had some bad luck. 5 more retirements than Albon, and some of these are mechanical. Some of them are collisions that had nothing to do with Verstappen. He get caught up in it. The first lap collision at the Tuscan Grand Prix, there's nothing he could have done there. Everyone was crashing, and he gets caught up in it. But why aren't both Red Bulls on the podium at the same time? I don't know. Maybe there's this team called Mercedes that has Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton light years ahead in speed from every other team right now. Any Grand Prix, it's reasonable to assume that 2 of the 3 podium spots are going to be Mercedes drivers. Something extraordinary has to happen, like first lap collisions or a Lewis Hamilton getting penalties, which has happened 2 of the last 3 weeks, that have cost him not even a chance at a podium, because he still finished on the podium this week. But it has to, something like that has to happen. Otherwise, 2 of the 3 cars are going to be Mercedes every time. So it's easy to sit there and say, well, look, when Verstappen podiums, Albon doesn't. When Albon podiums, Verstappen doesn't. Well, yeah, that's because Mercedes is taking up the other 2 spots all the time. And the times that it doesn't, sometimes it's because, there's a massive mayhem on the racetrack. Well, Mercedes is probably getting caught up in that too. Or you have situations where Hamilton is getting penalties, like he did last week and a couple weeks ago when, they tried to box and beat the safety car, but they boxed too soon because of where Kevin Magnussen was. So the only time that you would really have a chance for both Red Bull drivers to be on the podium together is when extraordinary things happen to some of the leading cars, like Bottas and Hamilton. So overall, this whole narrative of Verstappen does well, Albon does poorly, and vice versa, it's a ridiculous narrative. And if you want to isolate other races, the Styrian Grand Prix, Albon podiums, Verstappen podiums, and Albon finishes 4th. I mean, there's been plenty of races where they've been within 2 or 3 spots of each other, both up front. The only thing we haven't had yet is both Red Bulls on the podium at the same time. And honestly, if things go right during the Grand Prix, we're not going to have that this year and probably next year because of how good Mercedes is. It's a bit of a tall ask. And it seems likely that if Albon's going to podium, it's because something happened to Verstappen or one of the other, 2 Mercedes drivers. So, no, there is no Max Verstappen versus Alex Albon paradox where for one driver to do well, the other driver has to have a bad weekend. It's not a good narrative at all. We know that the number 2 seed at Red Bull has been highly scrutinized all year for a plethora of reasons. Obviously this last week, Pierre Gasly outperforms Albon again, so it brings up these questions. But we also know that Albon's not running the same equipment and parts on his car as Verstappen. And if you look at the overall 2019 and 2020 picture, regardless of what Max does, 7th place is just the average for Albon right now. And the focus at Red Bull isn't why one driver can do well and the other isn't. It's got to be, how do we make that 7th, a 4th or a 3rd moving forward consistently for Alex Albon? And that has nothing to do with Max Verstappen at all, whatsoever. And if he does start finishing 3rd a bunch, I don't think overall on average, if we get enough Grand Prix under our belt, that's going to affect what Verstappen's doing either. So, hope you liked this video. If you did, please consider giving me a subscribe and a like. It definitely helps me out. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.